My stepfather didn't lower his voice. That was the thing I remember most clearly. He didn't even try. "Do we really have to stand here next to her?" he said, loud enough that the couple beside us turned to look. We were in the main hall of the Ashworth Club, one of those old Chicago institutions where the carpet costs more than most people's cars, and the waitstaff all wear white gloves. 400 people had come out for my half-brother's engagement party. The chandeliers were lit. The champagne was cold, and my stepfather was gesturing at me the way you'd gesture at a stain on a good shirt. My half-brother didn't say anything. He just shifted slightly to the left, creating maybe 18 inches of distance between us, and went back to his conversation. I stayed exactly where I was. I was wearing a dress I had borrowed from a coworker, navy blue, a little too long in the hem. I'd had my hair done at a salon that charged $40, which I considered a splurge. Everyone else in that room was wearing something that cost 4 figures minimum, and they could tell. People have a way of knowing. Their eyes would land on me for a half second, make some quiet calculation, and slide away. I had stopped being surprised by that a long time ago. What I hadn't expected was my stepfather saying it out loud at a party in front of people who knew my name. "She looks like she wandered in from the street," he added, and then he laughed at his own joke, the way he always did. There were about 6 people within earshot. One woman pressed her lips together. A man near the bar pretended to check his phone. Nobody said a word to me, not one person. I thought about leaving. I thought about it seriously, the way you think about a door in a room that's filling with water. But I didn't move. I had driven 4 hours to be in that room, and I had not done it to disappear. I found a spot near one of the tall windows where the cold came through the glass in December the way it always does in Chicago, and I stood there and I waited. I didn't know yet what I was waiting for, but I stayed. My mother married my stepfather when I was 9. Before that, it had been just the two of us in a 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston. My mother working double shifts at a hospital billing office, me doing homework on the kitchen table and warming up whatever she'd left in the fridge. It wasn't a hard life exactly, it was just a narrow one. When she married him, the apartment became a house. The house had a yard. My stepfather had a son from his first marriage, my half-brother, who was 7 and already had the comfortable assumption of someone who has never been told no. His name was Fletcher, and he and I were never unkind to each other exactly. We were just strangers who happened to share a bathroom. My stepfather had a particular way of making clear what he thought of me without ever saying it directly. He would introduce Fletcher to his colleagues at dinner parties and not introduce me at all. He would discuss Fletcher's school performance at the table and ask me, if he remembered to ask me, how things were going, as if I were a neighbor's kid who'd wandered in. When I won a full scholarship to Northwestern at 17, he told my mother it was good news, but that I shouldn't expect it to translate into anything too ambitious. Finance was a competitive field, and connections mattered more than grades. I didn't say anything. I had learned by then that saying things didn't change anything in that house. I studied finance anyway. I worked campus jobs. I networked in ways that felt unnatural and painful at first. Attending every professional mixer, emailing professors whose research I'd actually read, staying late in the library until I understood things well enough to sound like I'd always known them. By the time I graduated, I had 3 job offers and a GPA my stepfather had never asked about. He didn't come to graduation. He had a golf commitment. My mother came alone and cried at the ceremony and apologized for him on the drive home, which was the dynamic we'd always had. I moved to Chicago after graduation. Not back to the suburbs, not back to the house with the yard, just Chicago. A studio apartment in Logan Square, a job at a mid-sized financial consulting firm that paid just enough to feel like a beginning. My stepfather told my mother, and she relayed this to me, that I was making a mistake. That I should come home, stabilize, think more carefully. I put his number on silent that day, and I didn't take it off for 4 years. The firm was a place that taught me things about myself I hadn't known I needed to learn. The first thing I learned was that competence without visibility is a transaction that only pays one side. I was good at the work, genuinely good. The kind of good where people start leaving things on your desk that are technically above your pay grade because they trust you to do them without making noise. I did them. I made no noise. I hid them. I made no noise. I told myself this was strategy. It wasn't strategy. It was a habit I brought with me from the house in the suburbs. There was a senior analyst at the firm named Warren. He was the kind of person who had never not been the smartest person in his own estimation, which is a particular type of person that financial consulting attracts. Warren noticed me the way a certain kind of person notices a useful tool, with appreciation and no further curiosity. Within a year, he was forwarding me his overflow, copying me into projects I hadn't been assigned to, and scheduling what he called collaborative sessions that were, in practice, me explaining my own thinking while he took notes and later presented it as synthesis. I watched him do this in a partners meeting once. He used 4 of my actual sentences, word for word, with the cadence slightly changed, the way you change a sentence to avoid a plagiarism detector. The partners nodded. One of them said, "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of, Warren." I sat at the far end of the table and nodded along. My performance reviews described me as reliable, detail-oriented, a strong team contributor. Not a word about initiative. Not a word about initiative. Not a word about leadership. I was, on paper, a very good supporting character, which is what happens when you let someone else write your story for 3 years running. The moment things shifted came on an unremarkable Tuesday in March. I was in the break room at 7:30 in the morning when a woman named Judith came in, looking for the French press. Judith was a partner. She'd been with the firm for 22 years, had a reputation for being difficult, which at that firm mostly meant she asked direct questions and didn't soften her feedback. The junior staff avoided her. I had made a point of not avoiding her. She saw me, registered my presence, and said, "You're the one who flagged the Hollister projection error." I was. The error had come through on Warren's work. I'd caught it, corrected it quietly, and sent it back without making an issue. "Why didn't you escalate it?" she said. "I fixed it," I said. "That's not what I asked. I thought about it." The honest answer was that I'd learned, in that office and in the house before it, that pointing out other people's errors was a way to make enemies faster than it made allies, that fixing things quietly was safer. "I thought it was more efficient," I said instead. She poured her coffee and looked at me for a moment. "Efficient for whom?" she said, and left. 3 weeks later, she pulled me into her office and asked me to walk her through how I approached risk modeling. Not a test, a real conversation, the kind where she'd push back when she disagreed and nod when she didn't. I left that meeting 2 hours later with the particular exhaustion of having been genuinely seen by someone for the first time in years. She became the person who changed what I understood about my own work. Not a mentor in the formal sense. She'd have found that framing precious. She was more like a mirror that didn't flatter. She showed me what I was doing and, more importantly, what I was allowing to be done. She told me once that the most dangerous professional habit a person could have was confusing being tolerated with being valued. I wrote it down that night on a sticky note and put it on my bathroom mirror, and I looked at it every morning for a year. Under her watch, I started treating my own contributions as things worth protecting. I kept records. I documented my process. I began presenting my work in meetings rather than handing it off. Warren's invitations for collaborative sessions became less frequent. He started describing me to colleagues as difficult, which I recognized as the vocabulary of a person who has lost a resource he thought was free. I left the firm 18 months later, not because I was pushed out, but because I had grown large enough for the container to feel wrong. Judith had introduced me, without ceremony, to a small private equity fund run by a woman named Gwen Alcott, who had started her fund with $2 million of her own savings and had grown it over 15 years into something that managed 9 figures in assets. Gwen was 61 and looked like a retired high school principal and had the negotiating instincts of a person who had spent decades being underestimated. She asked me in our first meeting what I wanted to be doing in 10 years. I told her the truth, which I had not been in the habit of telling people in professional settings. I wanted to build something. I didn't want to support someone else's vision. I wanted to have my own. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Why aren't you doing it now?" I didn't have a good answer. She offered me a position, analyst with equity participation and a defined track toward partnership. She was not interested in hiring someone who would be satisfied with the position. She wanted someone who would outgrow it and take the whole operation to the next level before they left. I said yes before she finished the sentence. The 5 years I spent at Alcott Capital were the years that made me, not because they were easy, they were the furthest thing from easy, but because they were the first years of my professional life where the stakes were genuinely mine. When I was right, it accrued to me. When I was wrong, I absorbed it and it made me more careful. There was no one to hand problems to and no one to hand credit away to. I made mistakes. A sector analysis I championed in my second year turned out to be built on assumptions that didn't survive contact with reality. We absorbed a loss that kept me awake for 3 months. Gwen never said, "I told you so." She said, "What did you miss?" and made me answer in full, and when I finished, she said, "Good. Don't miss it again." I didn't. In my 4th year, I identified a healthcare data company that every larger fund had passed on. The founder was a braces, the technology was unproven at scale, the regulatory landscape was complicated. I spent 6 weeks meeting with the founder, going through every filing, talking to her customers, walking through her distribution plan. She was difficult in the way that people who are building something real and are very afraid it will be taken from them are difficult. I recognized that specific fear on sight. I told Gwen we should invest. Gwen asked me to defend it in front of the full investment committee, which meant 4 people who had collectively been doing this for longer than I'd been alive asking me pointed questions for 90 minutes while I stood at a whiteboard and did not flinch. We invested. 3 years later, the company was acquired by a hospital network for a number that made the original investment look like a rounding error. It was the kind of outcome that changes the conversation about who you are in a room. By my 5th year, I had a carried interest stake in several positions, a reputation that had spread through the Chicago private equity community in the quiet way that solid reputations spread, and an offer from a larger fund to come in as a general partner. I was 32 years old. I didn't take the offer. Gwen was ready to retire. After a process that took the better part of a year, due diligence, investor relations, legal structures, I bought her out. Majority ownership transferred to me. The fund was renamed. The press release went out on a Wednesday morning, and by Thursday, my phone had 53 messages, and by Friday, the story had run in Crane's Chicago business and been picked up by 2 national finance outlets. My stepfather's name was not mentioned in any of them. Mine was. Fletcher called me on a Sunday in October, which was already unusual. We talked maybe twice a year. Dutiful calls that lasted 10 minutes and covered nothing. "Hey," he said, and then there was a pause. "So Dad mentioned you've been doing well." I almost laughed. My stepfather had described what I'd built as doing well, like I'd gotten a promotion and a small raise. "I'm doing well," I confirmed. "The engagement party is in December," Fletcher said. "At the Ashworth Club. We would want you to come." He didn't say he would want me there. He said they would want me there. I noted the difference. I went anyway. I had my own reasons. The party was the kind of event that announces itself before you walk in. Valets in black coats, a string quartet in the lobby, an open bar staffed by 3 people. Fletcher's fiancée was from a prominent Lake Forest family. Old Chicago money, the kind that gets its own paragraph in society columns. My stepfather was in his element, working the room in a charcoal suit that fit the way expensive things fit, shaking hands with people he needed things from. He saw me come in and his face did something complicated. There was a version of him that wanted to pretend warmth. There was another version that had already made an assessment of my dress and my shoes and was struggling to reconcile that assessment with the fact that I had been apparently mentioned in the business press. "You made it," he said. "You invited me," I said. He introduced me to the couple next to him as Fletcher's stepsister, without a name. The couple smiled politely and turned back to their conversation. My stepfather drifted away to find someone more useful to talk to. I found a spot near the window and watched the room. I recognized several people. A man I'd worked with briefly 5 years ago, now running a real estate investment trust. A woman who sat on the board of a healthcare nonprofit that Alcott Capital had consulted with. A former regulator I testified before during a fund registration process. They were circulating through the same room as my stepfather and had no idea we were connected. Fletcher found me about 40 minutes in. He looked like he'd been rehearsing something. "You clean up well," he said, which I think was meant as a compliment. "Thank you for inviting me," I said, because I meant it, even though his reasons were unclear and probably had more to do with appearances than affection. We talked for a few minutes, surface things, safe things. He asked how the fund was going. I told him it was going well. He nodded as if he understood what that meant. It was about 20 minutes after that when my stepfather made the comment about the street. I heard it, and I felt it move through me the way cold water moves through you, fast and clarifying. I looked at him for a moment. The man who had spent 20 years making clear I was an inconvenience in his household. And I thought, not yet. Not here. Not like this. I turned back to the window. The shift in the room came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. A man approached me near the champagne table, late 50s, silver-haired, the kind of bearing that comes from decades of board meetings. I recognized him immediately. His name was Edmund Holt. He had been one of Gwen's earliest investors, back before Alcott Capital had a track record worth mentioning, and he sat on the advisory boards of 3 Midwest private equity funds, including mine. "I thought that was you," he said, extending his hand. "I didn't realize you had a connection to this family." "It's a long story," I said. He smiled. "I was just telling Gerald," he gestured toward a man across the room, "that we need to get you on the panel at the Midwest Capital Forum in February. Your healthcare data exit has been the case study everyone's citing." He said this at full conversational volume. Not loud exactly. Edmund Holt didn't need to raise his voice for things to carry. But we were standing in a small cluster of people, and the sound traveled. I saw my stepfather's head turn. Edmund continued, "I understand the fund has grown significantly since the transition. What are you sitting at now?" I told him. The number was not a small number. There was a pause in the conversation cluster around us. I watched 2 people process it, their expressions cycling through surprise and then something more complicated. A woman I didn't recognize leaned slightly toward the woman next to her and said something I couldn't hear. My stepfather had drifted close enough to be within earshot. I could see him trying to locate the context for this conversation, trying to understand how his inconvenient stepdaughter fit into a conversation that Edmund Holt was having with genuine interest. "You own the fund?" the woman behind him said, not quietly. "She does," Edmund said pleasantly, as if this were simply a clarifying detail. "Majority owner and managing partner. She took over from Gwen Alcott about 18 months ago. Built the portfolio significantly since the transition." He looked at me. I have to say, the Meridian deal alone was worth the price of admission. The small silence that followed had a particular quality. I have been in enough rooms to know what that silence means. It means that a calculation has just been revised. My stepfather said in a voice I'd heard before, the one where he was trying to maintain composure while something underneath it was giving way. "I wasn't aware you were running a fund." "You didn't ask," I said. "It wasn't cruel. It was just accurate." Fletcher appeared beside his father, his expression tight. He put a hand on my stepfather's arm, a gesture that was half comfort and half containment. "Maybe we should get some fresh air," he said. My stepfather didn't move. He was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, not dismissal, but something that looked almost like recalibration. Like a man who had built an entire map of a city and just discovered he'd been looking at it upside down. "She was supposed to," he started and then stopped. "Supposed to what?" I said. He didn't finish the sentence. Edmund Holt, with the grace of someone who had witnessed many difficult moments and knew when not to intervene, excused himself to find Gerald. The cluster around us dispersed by degrees, the way people do when they sense that what's happening is private even if it's happening in public. I looked at my stepfather. Just the 2 of us now, Fletcher hovering at the edge. "You called me a street person tonight," I said. "In front of your guests." He opened his mouth. "I'm not angry about it," I said, and I meant it. I've had a lot of years to not be angry about things like that. What I am is done pretending it didn't happen. He was quiet. This was unusual for him. "I have not once asked you for anything," I continued. "Not money, not a connection, not a reference. I built what I built without you, which is something you should actually be relieved about, because it means nothing I've done is yours." I paused. "But what I'm not going to do anymore is walk into rooms where you're the one who sets the terms. Those days are finished." Fletcher was looking at the floor. My stepfather said, finally, in a voice that was smaller than I'd ever heard from him, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "You didn't know because you weren't interested in knowing. Those are 2 different things." I found Fletcher near the coat check about an hour later, after the formal toasts had been made and the party had started winding down into smaller conversations. He had a drink he'd barely touched. "The woman who just handed me her card," he said without preamble. "She's on the board of a children's hospital. She asked if you'd be open to a conversation about a foundation partnership." "I'll think about it," I said. He nodded. We stood in silence for a moment, the 2 of us, which was unusual. We had spent most of our shared life being polite strangers. I had not expected him to have anything real to say. I should have said something, he said finally. Tonight. Earlier. You should have said something for the last 20 years, I said. Not unkindly, but plainly, I know. He looked up. I don't know what I thought. That it wasn't my business, that you were capable enough to handle it without me. He paused. That's not actually what I thought. That's just what I told myself. I looked at him. He was 30 years old, engaged to a woman he clearly loved, the beneficiary of every door his father had opened for him, and for the first time in my memory, he looked genuinely uncertain. What do you want, Fletcher? I said. Not from tonight, in general. He thought about it. I'd like to know you, he said, as a real person, not as whatever we've been. That's not nothing, I said. Is it enough? I said, is it enough? I don't know yet, I said honestly, but it's a place to start, if you're serious about it. He nodded. I believed him, which surprised me. My stepfather caught me at the door. I had my coat on, my bag over my shoulder. He looked like a man who had spent the last 2 hours having a conversation with himself and hadn't enjoyed what he'd found there. Anna, he started and then stopped. Sorry, old habit. My name was not Anna. He had called me Anna for years, a small constant error that I had stopped correcting because it had always seemed deliberate. Leigh, I said. It's Leigh. Leigh. He said it carefully, like a word in a language he was just starting to learn. I owe you something. You don't owe me anything, I said. What I needed from you, I needed when I was 9. It's too late for that. He flinched. Good. What you can do, I said, is not do to some other kid what you did to me. If you ever find yourself in a room with someone who doesn't belong, by your accounting, just leave them alone. That's all. Just leave them alone. He didn't respond. I didn't expect him to. I walked out into the December cold. The valet brought my car, not a borrowed dress this time, not $40 shoes, just me in the cold Chicago air, breathing it in. The city was lit and loud and completely indifferent to what had just happened inside that building, the way cities are, which I have always found more comforting than people expect. I sat in my car for a moment before I started it. I had spent a long time waiting for a feeling that I understood, in theory, should come. Something cathartic. Something like closure snapping shut. What I felt instead was quieter. Not triumph. Not even satisfaction, exactly. Just the particular stillness of a thing that has finally been said out loud. I started the car. Chicago spread out in front of me, every light in it belonging to someone who was in the middle of their own version of this story, working something out, building something, letting something go. I had a 7 a.m. call in the morning with a founder whose company I was considering backing. A woman who had been turned down by 11 other funds and was on her last serious ask before she'd have to fold. I had read every page of her pitch. I thought she was going to make it. I merged onto Lakeshore Drive and let the skyline do what it always did, which was remind me that the city had no opinion about where I'd started, only about what I did next. I drove home through the dark, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, completely free. I've thought a lot about what my stepfather actually lost that night at the Ashworth Club. Not status. He still had that, at least in the circles that hadn't been in the room. Not money. What he lost was a story he had been telling himself for 20 years, the one where I was the variable that didn't compute, the daughter-shaped inconvenience that his life had simply absorbed and moved past. That story had been comfortable for him. It had required nothing, and in about 90 seconds, standing near a champagne table in a room full of his peers, Edmund Holt had made it impossible for him to keep telling it. I don't think that's justice in any formal sense. I don't think the universe arranged that moment as a correction. What I think is simpler and, honestly, harder, the actions we take accumulate. The years I spent doing the work, real work, unglamorous work, the kind of work where you're sitting at a desk at midnight fixing someone else's error and not getting credit for it, those years built something. Not immediately, not in a way that was visible or rewarded in the moment. But they built something real, and real things persist. My stepfather spent 20 years not building anything between us. He made a calculation, consciously or not, that I was not worth the investment of his attention. That calculation had a cost. Not a punitive cost. I don't believe in punishment as a useful frame, but a natural one. You don't tend something, it doesn't grow. You dismiss someone completely enough for long enough, and one day you find yourself in a room where everyone around you knows who they are, and you're the one who doesn't recognize the landscape. What I learned from Judith changed me more than any single outcome ever did. She asked me once who I was being efficient for, and that question followed me for years because the honest answer was, for everyone except myself. I had taken the instinct I developed as a kid in that house, the instinct to make myself small, undemanding, easy to overlook, and I had carried it into every professional room I entered and called it strategy. It wasn't strategy. It was fear, with better vocabulary. The intelligence I had wasn't the problem. The work ethic wasn't the problem. The problem was that I had spent years applying both of those things in service of other people's recognition while quietly believing I didn't deserve my own. That is the thing nobody talks about when they talk about resilience. That resilience without self-respect is just endurance. And endurance without direction just means you survive longer inside someone else's story. I drove home that December night thinking about the founder I had a call with in the morning. The woman who had been turned down 11 times and was still in the room, still making her case. I recognized her. I had been her. What I wanted to give her wasn't charity. It was what Judith had given me, which was the simple and radical act of being taken seriously by someone who had no obligation to do so. That, more than anything, is what I took from the wreckage of that night. Not that I had won something, but that the habits we build toward honesty, toward rigor, toward refusing to disappear, those habits make us into people who can eventually stand in any room without apology. And the people who spent years betting against us have to live with the very simple fact that they were wrong. That's enough. It really is.